Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's really been a pleasure to be here, to be out of the insanity of Washington just for a few days, to have an adult conversation with committed activists, and it's just an absolute pleasure to be here. I laughed when Ellen mentioned that she wasn't exactly sure what Jamie's job was, and that was a problem for me for a long time. My father's an auto worker, and his union, the UAW, sent me to university where I studied economics. And when I worked in a couple different unions, and when I became research director at the NALC, which I did for about 15 years, he had no clue about what I did for a living. And then when I took the job as chief of staff, which is this horrible, pompous kind of title that's very common in Washington, suddenly my mother informed him that she knew what I did, which was having something to do with Leo McGarry on the West Wing. So, which absolutely horrified me. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to thank, I think I'm really here because of the power of the written word. You know, Alan wrote an article about postal banking, and that inspired one of our best activists in the union, who I think is here today, Dave Welsh from our local branch in San Francisco. And I want to thank him because he used Ellen's work to propose a resolution at our national convention in Minneapolis last summer. And that resolution was adopted, and it calls for the investigation of the creation of a postal savings bank. And so that's one of the reasons I'm here, and I'm really thankful for Dave for doing that. Ying just covered a bit about the crisis. It got mentioned yesterday when Gray spoke. I'll just say that we see a public banking option as one of the best solutions for saving the Postal Service. And so that's why we as a union are dedicated to working with all of you to find a way to make that happen. As Ying mentioned, the crisis we're facing is really it's sort of a perfect storm. There's a structural crisis facing almost every paper-based industry. We all know that. The newspaper industry, magazine publishing. There's really nobody's being spared. So we do have a serious underlying technological problem. In addition, though, and what's really tragic is that the severity of the current crisis is entirely man-made. This was a congressionally manufactured crisis. And sad to say, it was a bipartisan manufactured crisis. Now, yesterday people were wondering, well, who's behind this? Was it Susan Collins? Well, I'm sad to say that one of the main sponsors of the 2006 law was Henry Waxman from California. And so that was a bipartisan bill, and it required the Postal Service to pay 75 years in advance future retiree health premiums. There's no company in America that's required to do that. No other agency is required to do that. And this put a $5.5 billion cost on the Postal Service per year for 10 years at a time when the economy went off the cliff. And simultaneously, all the big mailers, big corporate mailers, got provisions put into that law that prohibited the Postal Service from raising the rates. So what did they do? They massively increased our costs, and they put a cap on rates. It was absolutely designed to crush the unions, force labor concessions, and lead to the breakup of the Postal Service. So over the last 7 years, the Postal Service has recorded $40 billion in losses. $32 billion of that come from the pre-funding mandate. So this company is in desperate trouble, and this public service is in desperate trouble because of what Congress did. We've been fighting as a union for reform that will maintain the Postal Service as a government-owned universal service. Unfortunately, we've been on the defensive, particularly since the Republicans came back into power in the House. Their plans, I only have to say one name and you'll know what the kind of plan it is. The chairman of the committee that writes the legislation on Postal Services is Darrell Issa. So the ISA plan is essentially to put the Postal Service into receivership, bring in a control board, and just basically mandate closing half the post offices in the country, eliminating half the mail processing plants, cutting door-to-door service. Imagine if you're elderly or disabled, The idea that they're going to build a community mailbox halfway down the street for you to go get your mail. This is, and obviously from our point of view, there's provisions to allow this Financial Control Board to essentially rip up our labor contracts and impose concessions. So we've been fighting very hard. Fortunately, the Postal Service has tremendous public support. The Postal Service in the recent Pew Trust survey found that 83% of Americans had a favorable view of the Postal Service. And despite a lot of rhetoric from the right wing, people realize that it's an incredibly valuable service and incredibly affordable, that you can reach any other of 150 million addresses 6 days a week for 46 cents. So we've been fighting, resisting this, and because of, I think, that popularity, Darrell Issa couldn't even get a vote on his bill in Congress. John Boehner would not even let him bring it up before last year's election. So we've been pushing an alternative plan. Our plan is, our basic message is, don't dismantle this institution, reinvent it, improve it, expand it. There's all sorts of new services that could be provided if we had the courage to do it. We are pushing initiatives like vote by mail, which has transformed our democracy, and especially on the West Coast. In Oregon, they do all their elections by mail. That's the only option. They get 87% turnout. That's great for progressive politics. We've advocated letting the Postal Service do meter reading for utility companies. All over the country, there's huge fights in public utility commissions to put expensive, remotely censored meters across the country. Our members are going door to door every day of the week, 6 days a week. This could be a service that we could provide through the Postal Service. We could do state and local government services from the post office. We could create recycling centers of the kind they have in Germany. In Germany, if you sell electronic equipment, you're required to recycle that equipment when you're done with it. They have a system with the Deutsche Post to return those electronic cell phones and tablets to the companies for proper recycling. It's an excellent new business service. And of course, we're interested in promoting banking services, which has brought all of you here this week. Of course, this would be a very natural network for banking services. The Postal Service, despite these closures, still has 32,000 post offices all over the country. And most importantly, they're located in our communities where they're accessible. And so many banks have sort of left rural America on its own. In many cities, I read in Business Week last week that the number of bank branches in urban settings has declined by about 2,500 since 2008. And there's a prediction that 40% of bank branches, private bank branches, will close in urban America over the next 10 years. So we have a very trusted position. The Postal Service has won the most trusted federal agency in an annual survey by the Poneman Institute in terms of protecting the privacy of American citizens. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of public support. Now, you can imagine making a proposal in today's Washington to start a postal bank. You imagine how that goes over with the Tea Party and the right wing. So there's almost a suggestion that it's un-American. Well, as Ellen's research has shown and history indicates, our own history shows that's not true. We had a very successful postal savings bank in the United States that operated between 1911 and 1966. It was inspired by the British model that is traced all the way back to the 1860s. And it was geared towards working class Americans, small, low-income savers. It provided a way, particularly for migrant workers, immigrant workers, who didn't have a lot to save, but a very low-cost, affordable way to save and keep their keep their money in a safe place. Thanks to just repeated bank panics in the 19th century and early 20th century, and particularly the 1907 panic, which caused thousands of banks to fail everywhere, Congress adopted a postal savings bank in 1910. This bank had faced tremendous resistance from the start. Private banks did everything they could to hamper its growth. They put caps on how much the account balances. The initial balances were limited to $500. That was raised over time and eventually rose to $2,500 in the 1950s. There was a cap on the interest rates that could be paid on the savings account. They required the Postal Service, rather than invest the money in the communities, they required the Postal Service to put their deposits in other private banks, which was obviously not a model we'd want to replicate today. But nonetheless, it was very successful. By 1947, there were 4.2 million Americans who had an account at the post office, and they had assets of $3.4 billion and an average account balance of about $800. In today's dollars, that would be about $30 billion total and an average account balance of $8,000. Now imagine if those kinds of resources were available for community investment. So after the war, of course, with the Depression came the FDIC, which was a very good thing. Deposit insurance, so that really sort of doomed the Postal Savings Bank, at least as it was constructed. With a cap on interest rates and the economy booming, the Postal Service really couldn't compete with private banks on the interest they paid on accounts, and the Postal Service Bank went into decline. So by 1966, the Congress voted to disband the system. So you might think, well, that's an old idea. It went out of fashion. But if you look around the world, and Jamie mentioned that she's an account holder at the Post Bank in Switzerland, postal savings banks are common all across the globe. More than 1 billion people have accounts at postal savings banks around the world. Some of the fastest growing banks in the world in China and India are postal banks. There are 51 fully functioning banks among the members of the Universal Postal Union. I think the most famously successful bank is probably the Japanese Postal Savings Bank. It had, at one point, assets of $1.7 trillion. It's the biggest bank in the world. It was literally the bank that rebuilt Japan after the war. At its height, it was unfortunately privatized about 5 or 6 years ago. It still operates, but it's in the process of being privatized. But at its height, 85% of Japanese households had an account at the Japanese Savings Bank. And 61% of Japanese households bought insurance from the Japanese Postal Savings Bank. So it had a huge impact on the rebuilding Japan. Now, I think it's really interesting to look at what it was that led to the privatization of the Japanese bank. It was essentially driven by the American Chamber of Commerce in Tokyo. They did not like they just could not compete with a bank that the Japanese people liked so much and government policy favored. The Japanese were allowed to keep up to $85,000 in the Japanese Postal Savings Bank, and the interest on it was tax-free. So this gave them a tremendous source of capital. So what did all the neoliberal economists complain about? These are the two big complaints about Japan. Japanese save too much and they invest too much in public infrastructure. Yeah, that was the criticism. Now look at our situation. We talked yesterday about the legacy of the New Deal. Our situation is just the opposite. We don't save anything and we stop public investing at all. This seems to me the solution to our problem. If we could amass the kind of resources to reinvest in American infrastructure, this could be the model to do it, and we have the network in place to make it happen. Now, just so you know, there was a time most European post offices had postal savings banks, along with telecom companies and telegraph. These PTTs were developed all after the war. Most of them, just like the Washington Consensus, infected economic policy all over the world. And so all during the 70s and 80s, all these PTTs were broken up and broken apart and sold off. What's interesting is that many, many countries in Europe that sold their postal banks have now these post offices have now initiated new postal banks, just in recent years, France and Britain in particular. In Germany, they sold off the postal bank to Deutsche Bank, and 5 years later, the post office bought it back. They found out it's a good business. It's good for the mail business as well as finance. So this is something that's not out of fashion or old-fashioned. It's actually a current trend in the world to create postal savings banks. In New Zealand, for example, in 2002, many rural communities had just been abandoned by the big banks. Most of them are Australian. There's 4 big Australian banks that dominate New Zealand finance. They just abandoned many parts of rural New Zealand, so the New Zealand Post set up Kiwi Bank, their own postal bank. Within a year or two, they had 800,000 accounts in New Zealand. Doesn't sound like a lot, but there's only 4 million people in New Zealand. So they have 100% coverage, and it shows that there can be quite a demand for it. Similarly, in Italy, back in the late 1990s, Italy's changed from being sort of a post office bank, changed from being a sort of correspondent bank to setting up a bank of their own. And over time, they've added checking accounts, foreign exchange services, electronic payment systems. Now it's a major source of profit that is funneling investment into the postal infrastructure itself. It ended decades of annual losses for the Postal Service in Italy and now turned it into a profitable public institution. In Brazil, I think is in some ways really an important case for us because we have a tremendous problem in the United States with financial exclusion. I think the latest FDIC survey said 28% of American households are unbanked or underbanked. That's tens of millions of people. In Brazil, they had the same problem. They created a postal bank in 2000. Now, this was a right-wing government, so of course they prohibited all the public banks in Brazil from bidding on the contract. But the private bank that did get the contract did end up opening 6,000 branches all across the country, and including 2,000 in cities that never had a bank before. And it's had a tremendous, powerful impact on these communities. In addition to allowing folks to have a banking account at the post office, this was combined with a microcredit facility that allows account holders to borrow up to the value of their account. So this microcredit facility has spawned the development of tens of thousands of small businesses. 140,000 accounts opened up in the first month, and now in just 10 years they have 10 million accounts across Brazil. It's a very successful bank, and thankfully when Lula's party came in, they renegotiated and reopened the bid, and a public bank, Banco do Brasil, won the contract. If you want to know how successful the bank is, Banco do Brasil paid 10 times the amount that the private bank paid when they put the bank up for bid again. And they committed $1.7 billion to it. And they were also agreed to pay $370 million to provide banking services for all sorts of Brazilian public agencies. So this is a perfect example of public agency putting public money into a public bank to serve the public good. It's an excellent model for us. And what's been particularly good for the Brazilian post office is that a lot of the profits have been funneled into buying new vehicles, offering new services, adding logistics, and just actually improving the public service instead of dismantling it. So how are we going to do this in the United States? This is a challenge, particularly in the world I live in, which is our building is literally kitty corner to the U.S. Capitol. And I'm afraid I've committed the sin that Rabbi Lerner warned us against about being practical. It would be very self-defeating if we just put out a proposal, put in legislation to create a full-scale postal savings bank in the United States Postal Service at the moment. So what the NALC has been focused on is looking at 2 avenues to get our foot in the door. One is there's a tremendous debate and a lot of bipartisan support in the Congress about creating a national infrastructure bank. The problem is the Tea Party has blocked any efforts to do so because there's a price tag. There's a $10 billion price tag just to capitalize this infrastructure bank and various different bills that proposed it. What if we used postal savings banks, voluntary accounts set up in the Postal Service to capitalize a national infrastructure bank? It would be easily done. This would not be a use of any taxpayer money. These would be accounts set up by Americans voluntarily in the Postal Service, with the understanding that the Postal Service would use the money for some sort of a national infrastructure board for nationally significant infrastructure projects. Similarly, another avenue in that is to build on an existing service we have that is way too limited. The Postal Service does offer money orders. They do more than 1 million money orders a year. And they do offer a service, international remittance services, to a selected number of countries in Latin America. It's called Dinero Seguro. It serves 9 countries in Latin America, and it's really targeted towards that huge number of immigrant workers in the United States that send home tens of billions of dollars every year to their families in the countries from which they come. At least $50 to $60 billion is sent from the US every year. That's probably an underestimate because there's a lot of black market remittance services. The folks who go and the vast majority of folks go to very small, often they're payday loan operations or pawn shops or places in their neighborhoods that charge an enormous amount of money. The World Bank has found that fees on the average remittance service from the United States, a remittance payment, is about $200, and the fees average up to 25%. So the Postal Service on their existing service charges 5%. And we could get that service way down low if we expanded this to make it a universal remittance service. So NALC has worked with our global union, Uni Global Union, in Switzerland. It's based in Lyon. And we've been working with the Universal Postal Union, which is a UN agency that regulates international mail flows. They've developed this system called the IFS, International Financial Service. It's a very low-cost system designed to be put in post offices all over the world. It costs only about $20,000 for the software, which for a lot of African countries would be a lot, but most of the money, most of these, their installations have been paid for through grants from the World Bank. This system allows literally anybody to send money from one post office to any other post office in the world. There are 660,000 post offices in the world. This provides a universal remittance service, and we could build that service in the United States Postal Service. So what I'm really excited about, these are the sort of the 2 avenues that we were looking at to try to get into this business, even over the last 4 or 5 years. And what getting Ellen's article and Dave's resolution and my being here this week has really opened my eyes to all sorts of other options. I mean, we talked earlier about the brother from Orlando about the city putting all their money in Wells Fargo. Imagine if we had, if we could establish public banks all over the country and mandate through Congress that the Postal Service deposit its revenues in the public banks. The Postal Service annual revenues right now is about $65 billion a year. It's a tremendous cash flow all the time that could serve to capitalize local public banks. So we don't have to go all the way with a full-scale bank. It's clear from this week, there's lots of in-between steps that we can build some momentum on this idea. So I'm really happy to announce today that we've been having conversations with Mark Armstrong, and I've reached out to our brothers and sisters in the American Postal Workers Union. There's 2 very large national unions. Between us, we have about 550,000 members. And both unions have agreed to financially support a project in partnership with the PBI to explore and investigate options for a postal bank. So we have this is going to be the easy part's going to come up with these wonderful plans, I'm afraid. The hard part is going to be getting it through Congress. So we have a big fight ahead of us. I guess the first things first for us, and this is where I'm really here to make a plea to all of you, to help us win this fight to save the Postal Service. There's just a tremendous, I'll just give you three avenues for you to do that. First of all, the National NALC has set up a coalition, and to be brutally honest, we've sort of focused on red states for this, to try to pressure to get the votes that we need. But we've got, if you go to deliveringforamerica.org, you can learn about a coalition that we've built that includes now more than 5,000 small businesses, chambers of commerce, veterans organizations, organizations for senior citizens that are fighting with us to support a sensible postal reform. There's also many, and our San Francisco branch is at the forefront of this. There's a group called Community and Postal Workers United that includes a whole range of community organizations that are working all over the country to protest these post office closings, to fight for jobs in these in the processing plants, and to make sure that Congress feels some heat from the voters on fixing the Postal Service. And there's also an excellent source run by an NYU professor who started on this just because his local post office was going to be closed, and now it's become an absolute great source of information on closings all over the country. It's called SaveThePostOffice.com. If you could find ways to get involved with this fight, we would really appreciate your help. Let me just say that you know, I really was inspired by Gara Perwitz's his admonition today to really think long term. We're laying the groundwork for something really special. And I laughed about it because in doing research on the history of our Postal Savings Bank, I found that the first bill to create a Postal Savings Bank in the United States was introduced in 1877. So it took from 1877 to 1910 to get it done. So I'm here today hoping that in the age of the internet, that we can get it done a lot faster. And the one thing we have today that they didn't have in 1877, for one thing, we have unions that are there to fight, and we're going to do it. And the other thing we have is we have the PBI and all of you. So I really thank you for having me here today.